Oh, it looks like we're live. So, hello and welcome to another fun edition of Adam's Music Box. It's the Sunday edition, I think, of this show. We try to go live most Saturdays and Sundays, which together is known as the week, and for some reason, some would call it the week beginning. Anyway, today's topic is something that I've never really thought about or cared about, but it came up in an interesting conversation I had the other day. And because of that, I thought, this is actually somewhat of a more interesting topic than I would have initially thought. And that is, where does hard rock come from? I'm sure everyone plays it today. I mean, and by that I mean hardly anyone plays it anymore. But over the decades, it's a style of music that has been almost universal in terms of its popularity, in terms of the creative origins of the artists playing them. But if we go back to the beginning, where did it come from? And where, in its initial, most sort of vivacious phase, did it tend to congregate the most? Where did it coalesce? And so, like all genres, it's always difficult to point to a single moment or a single artist or a single piece of music where something changed, because most changes in art are gradual. Various things happen that create various artistic movements. Every now and then, you get a watershed moment in art. Beethoven's Ninth, for instance, maybe Frank Zappa's Freak Out as well. But those are the exceptions that prove the rule. So, what really began hard rock? Well, before we answer that question, let's go and see where it might have happened and why. And the consensus generally is that while pop music was throughout its existence, really, because I really say that pop music became a thing in the late 19th century when otherwise folkish music was commercialized, and as a result of its commercialization, it became more musically stratified, more musically complex. The musicianship got better. So this, of course, late 19th century, the age of the music publishing industry being huge, the age of self-playing instruments being incredibly popular, things like the player piano, and then eventually recorded sound catches on, the technology improves, and a few decades later, you get radio taking over, which really helped pop music. And throughout this era, while every culture did have their own unique pop music styles and their own unique pop music artists, in terms of global domination, pop music has always had a very American flavor, and that only increased over the years. And so, while the American pop music palette is undoubtedly the widest in the world, people have often said that hard rock and heavy metal are more of a British, and specifically most of the time even an English sort of invention, if you want to call it that. And certainly some of the most famous hard rock and heavy metal bands of the 70s and even to a degree in the 80s were from Britain rather than America. And I think most people would agree about that. I mean, when you look at the biggest hard rock, heavy metal bands of the 70s, you've got Zeppelin, Sabbath, Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, UFO. Judas Priest came out in the 70s. I think Iron Maiden at the very end of the 70s, but known more as an 80s band. Def Leppard were sort of pop hard rock, but they started off harder. White Snake. The list goes, Budgie, a bit more rare, but Metallica cited them as an influence, Saxon in the 80s. The list goes on. And so the question is why? And a lot of people, I think, try to over romanticize these kinds of whys, no matter what genre we're talking about. A lot of the whys have to do with technology, whether it's a specific sort of instrument that originated in or was popularized in a certain part of the world or a certain region of a country. And that also includes amplification. Now, the Marshall Amplifier Company was by no means the first company to make amplifiers designed for electronic guitars, electric bass guitars, and similar instruments. They were somewhat late to the game, but when Marshall came around in 1962, it did change everything because their amps were really powerful, and they produced a thick, powerful sound that could be loud without distortion, unless of course you wanted the distortion, which a lot of guitarists did. And where was Marshall from? Marshall was a UK brand. Fender amps obviously were big in the US, but Marshall came out of the UK. And it was that Marshall sound which I think created in many ways what the listener had come or has come to expect from at least that classic era of hard rock and heavy metal. And naturally, because it was a company from England, most of the guitar players who plugged into a Marshall were either from England or became famous there. So think people like Richie Blackmore, Eric Clapton, Pete Townsend, the Who not necessarily considered a hard rock band, but they were loud, and that's what we're getting out here. And of course, perhaps the most famous of all, along with Clapton, was of course none other than Jimi Hendrix, who obviously played on different amps when he was touring with on the soul and R&B circuit, playing with the Isley Brothers, where he taught a young Ernie Isley how to play guitar, who then went on to be someone on my list of the most underrated and great guitarists of all time, Ernie Isley. But when Hendrix came to England, he, while having a soulful style, he was playing hard rock. Not everyone would have necessarily called it that at the time, some would, but that's what he was playing with the Jimi Hendrix Experience. And that is the Jimi Hendrix guitar style that we all know and love. And again, Marshall amplifiers. Now, by the end of the 60s, Marshalls were available, everywhere that fine amplifiers are sold, except for maybe in China, but in most other places, you could get a Marshall. So why then did most of the heavy rock bands in the 70s and 80s keep coming out of England? And Scotland, bands like Nazareth, for example, Budgie was a Welsh band. Most of them were England, and particularly a lot of them were from the English Midlands, the Judas Priest, Black Sabbath, to name two of many. So why is that? Well, you could say that old habits die hard, and that because Marshall was an English company, people from England and from Britain tended to stick with it. You could maybe say that tariffs, maybe it had to do with tariffs, because in the 60s and 70s, there were tariffs. And that meant that in many cases, it was cheaper and more convenient to buy a domestically produced brand unless you were already a superstar for whom tariffs didn't make a difference. So there is that. There are other explanations too. There's one that I've heard before, and I think there is some truth to it. It's one of these sociological explanations, which is that the fact that Britain was pretty destroyed during the Second World War, and a lot of the kids who went on to be the first generation of heavy rockers grew up on bombed out streets. They were playing with discarded munitions and stuff like that. Many of their fathers died or were injured in the war. Think Roger Waters, not hard rock, but still progressive rock, which has always sort of been a cousin or brother of hard rock. So there's that sociological explanation, which I think could be. I think there may be some truth to that because a lot of this heavy rock came out of the most devastated parts of England. So I think that might be part of it. I think another part of it might be the nature of radio in the UK versus the US in the 60s and 70s. Now, by the end of the 60s, US radio was a really cool place to be because the FM dial was wide open. The big corporations didn't really care about it, so small business owners could buy an FM station and do what they want. The money wasn't great, but they were making a profit, some of them at least, which always helps. And obviously, throughout the 70s, FM became more professionalized, the profits became much bigger, but throughout the 60s and much of the 70s, and in some places all of the 70s, US FM radio was a really happy place where so many different genres were catered for and so many experimental styles that were far away removed from the sort of classic pop that had dominated AM radio still into the mid 60s. These outrageous and new genres were allowed to flourish. As a result, when you look at sort of the music charts, the Billboard charts in America in the late 60s and 70s, you see a much more diverse picture than you see in the UK charts. And there's a reason for that. In the UK, you had state sponsored radio, state sanctioned radio, and then you had pirate radio. But for most of this period, there wasn't too much in between. There was some, but not much. And the state run radio in the UK, the BBC, and again, it's a generalization, but on the whole, they didn't love prog rock, hard rock, heavy metal, experimental rock. They just didn't really like it. They'd be a lot more comfortable with very middle of the road pop music than the American FM stations. And so this created a very unique environment where, even though these bands kept coming out of the UK, as the 70s wore on, their biggest audiences were in the US. And in a particular part of the US, I mean, yes, they were popular all throughout the US, but it's really the Midwest that has always been sort of the king of the hard rock world. There are exceptions. Bands like Steppenwolf came out of LA, but they had a kind of psychedelic thing going on as well. And so, again, the US Midwest and the English Midlands, apart from being, middle, they have things in common because they were the industrial centers of both countries. So that itself is interesting sociologically. Do people from industrial towns, within coming from families who worked in factories, maybe many of the musicians did, do they gravitate towards this? I mean, look at Grand Funk Railroad, look at Ted Nugent, look at Alice Cooper, that heavy that heavy Michigan sound, for instance. REO Speedwagon, not necessarily hard rock, but they were from the Midwest and they could be loud when they wanted to be. So there could be a sociological explanation there. But yeah, so I think one of the things that sort of drove people also into hard rock is the fact that if you had no expectation of getting on the radio, there was less of an expectation to be commercial. Where in the US, you might think, right, we're really hard and grim, but if we just tone it down a bit, we'll get on FM radio, we'll get on the midnight special. Where in the UK, it was really sort of pop singers who dominated, and not even the kinds of singer songwriters. The UK charts were generally less sophisticated because they were less diverse than the US charts. But this probably, or at least according to this theory, may have had the effect of the hard rockers saying, right, we're not playing for a radio audience, at least not in our domestic market. We're playing to audiences on the road. We're playing to sell records through word of mouth, through press like the Melody Maker, that was very important in the UK market, that championed a lot of these bands. And they knew after a while that they would be playing for the US market, where they could get on the radio and they could get on things like Don Kirshner's rock concert, and the midnight special, and even maybe the Smothers Brothers, shows like that. And so I think that was a part of it. If there's no expectation that you'll ever be, smiling on the BBC, why not just do your thing and win the hardcore people over, which is what a lot of these bands did. Think Motorhead. I mean, no one in the UK played them on radio apart from some pirate stations. But they conquered the UK, then they conquered the US, and in many ways they were even too hardcore for a lot of US FM stations, even compared to your Judas Priest, who got Breaking the Law on FM and MTV, and that sort of thing. So I think all of these things contribute to this. All of these things are factors in all of this. But I think when it really comes down to it, it is the technology. I think that the fact that Marshall amplification came from a certain place at a certain time influenced the kind of music that they would play, in the same way that large concert halls influenced orchestras to become lusher and more professional and more dynamic in the middle of the 19th century. The technology, whether it's architecture, the instruments themselves, the amplifiers, the accoutrements, I sell guitar and guitar accessories, all of it, the accessories, it all adds up and it all helps to influence a certain school of thought that becomes a school of music. Some might even say a school of rock. And again, it is true that old habits die hard, but just to sort of recap all of this, okay, number one most important thing, Marshall amplifiers. Number two, tariffs and old habits die hard, which says a lot about Marshall amplifiers. Three, the difference in radio. These bands couldn't ever get on UK radio, and they realized after a certain point they didn't need to care, which probably kept them from trying to sound more commercial. So there was that. There was the post-war despair, especially in places like the English Midlands, which also explains why a lot of this music was so popular in the American Midwest. Another interesting thing is that a lot of these hard rock bands, um, they weren't really jolly, happy bands, which again, it sort of goes with the territory. But I'm not even talking into the sort of super dark ones, like with sort of satanic type of imagery, like Black Sabbath. But even your bands like Deep Purple, that where the songs were often sexual in Ian Gillan's lyrics, it still wasn't. I mean, Ian Gillan was very, he had a very dry humor, but it wasn't like smiley type of music. Uriah Heep, same thing. UFO, same thing. I would actually say that the first band to successfully combine a heavy sound with a happy sound, both lyrically and musically, was Van Halen. And I think that that was a watershed moment in its own right, because they combined the vaudevillian cheer of David Lee Roth with Eddie Van Halen's ability to write music that was both very heavy, but the chords were often very cheerful, the way that they made you feel. And maybe that was part of that LA legacy. If you combine Black Sabbath and the Eagles, sprinkle a bit of the Doors in, put it all in a blender and have it be delivered by a vaudevillian lead vocalist, you kind of get Van Halen. That was really an exception that proved the rule, but it did lead to many more people throughout the 80s trying to have a bit more of a sense of humor to things. I mean, Twisted Sister could be very hard, but come on, as Dee Snider admitted himself in Congress, at the Senate panel, you can't take all of this all too seriously. The video is a play on the Roadrunner and the Wile E. Coyote, after all, as he told the senators. So that was an important watershed moment too, which I think helped to Atlantify, is that a word? The genre of hard rock. So these are all factors which I think are important. Maybe none of them are correct. Maybe it's all just coincidence, and this whole thing is just bogus and over analytical. I don't know. But that's what the comment section is for. So let me know. And as always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.